June 26, 1975, a day that would ignite a firestorm of controversy. 2 FBI agents were gunned down in a brutal shootout on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Decades later, one name still echoes in connection with this tragic event: Leonard Peltier. But here's the twist. Just as the world seemed to forget him, President Joe Biden made a decision that stunned the nation. In one stroke of his pen, Biden commuted Peltier's sentence, freeing a man many call a political prisoner, while others label a cold-blooded killer. Why did Biden intervene? What does this decision mean for the victims, for justice, and for Biden's own legacy? The answers might shock you. Join us as we dive into the gripping story of murder, controversy, and a presidential decision that has everyone talking. On June 26, 1975, an unremarkable summer day in South Dakota turned into a defining moment in American history. The Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, home to the Oglala Sioux tribe, was already a hotbed of tension. Years of neglect, government overreach, and tribal disputes had created a volatile atmosphere. The reservation was steeped in fear and distrust, with violent clashes becoming a grim part of daily life. Against this backdrop, a deadly confrontation unfolded that would change lives forever. 2 FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams, were investigating reports of a stolen pair of cowboy boots. While the case itself seemed trivial, the context was anything but. The agents were pursuing a suspect linked to the American Indian Movement, AIM, a group that had been openly critical of federal authorities and was accused of fostering unrest on reservations. Pine Ridge was on edge, and law enforcement was determined to assert control. Kohler and Williams followed a red and white van they believed was connected to their investigation. As they approached a remote ranch on the reservation, they were met with a barrage of gunfire. Trapped in an open field with no cover, the agents were ambushed and quickly overwhelmed. Both men were shot at close range, execution style. Their bodies were later found beside their vehicles, and their deaths shocked the nation. This tragic event became the catalyst for one of the most controversial criminal cases in U.S. history. The FBI responded to the deaths of Kohler and Williams with overwhelming force. Over 150 agents, backed by helicopters and SWAT teams, descended upon Pine Ridge. The area was locked down, and a manhunt began for those involved in the shootout. Within days, the investigation pointed to Leonard Peltier, a prominent member of AIM, as one of the key suspects. Peltier was already a well-known figure in Native American activism. Born in 1944 on the Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation in North Dakota, he grew up witnessing the struggles of his people: poverty, discrimination, and systemic inequality. These experiences fueled his passion for activism, and he joined AIM in the early 1970s. AIM had become a symbol of resistance for Native Americans, advocating for treaty rights, sovereignty, and an end to federal exploitation of indigenous lands. For law enforcement, AIM was seen as a radical group that posed a threat to public order. Tensions between AIM members and federal agents had reached a boiling point months earlier during the occupation of Wounded Knee, a historic protest that ended in violence and arrests. Many believed the government was intent on dismantling AIM by any means necessary. After the Pine Ridge shootout, Leonard Peltier fled to Canada, fearing he wouldn't receive a fair trial in the United States. His fears were not unfounded. The FBI was determined to bring someone to justice for the deaths of Kohler and Williams, and Peltier became their primary target. Canadian authorities eventually arrested him in 1976, but his extradition to the US was mired in controversy. The FBI presented an affidavit from Myrtle Poor Bear, a Native American woman who claimed to have witnessed Peltier committing the murders. However, Poor Bear later recanted her testimony, stating that it had been coerced by federal agents. Despite these allegations of misconduct, Peltier was extradited to the United States and charged with the murders of the 2 FBI agents. His arrest marked the beginning of a legal battle that would expose deep flaws in the justice system and polarize public opinion for decades to come. The stage was set for one of the most contentious trials in American history, with Leonard Peltier at the center of a storm that would pit the federal government against Native American activists, leaving a legacy of mistrust and unanswered questions. Leonard Peltier's arrest and extradition marked the beginning of a dramatic legal ordeal that would capture the nation's attention. After fleeing to Canada following the Pine Ridge shootout, Peltier was on the run, fearful of what he believed would be a biased and unjust trial in the United States. The FBI, determined to bring someone to justice for the brutal deaths of their agents, relentlessly pursued him, making him their primary suspect. In 1976, Canadian authorities arrested Peltier. To secure his extradition, the FBI presented an affidavit from Myrtle Poor Bear, a Native American woman who claimed to have been Peltier's girlfriend and an eyewitness to the murders of Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams. Her testimony appeared damning, painting a picture of Peltier as a cold-blooded killer. However, the truth behind this affidavit would later become a focal point of controversy. Poor Bear later recanted her statement, revealing that she had never met Peltier and had been coerced by FBI agents into providing false testimony. This revelation cast a long shadow over the integrity of the FBI's case, raising troubling questions about the lengths the government was willing to go to secure Peltier's capture. Despite these allegations, Peltier was extradited to the United States, setting the stage for a trial that would expose deep flaws in the American justice system. From the very beginning, Peltier's defense team argued that he was being scapegoated. They pointed to the hostile political climate surrounding the American Indian movement and accused the FBI of framing him as part of a broader effort to discredit and dismantle AM. Meanwhile, the prosecution built its case on evidence that many would later call into question. The trial began in 1977 in Fargo, North Dakota, far from the Pine Ridge Reservation and the communities most affected by the events. The government's case against Peltier relied heavily on ballistic evidence and eyewitness testimonies, both of which would become deeply contested over time. Key pieces of evidence included a rifle alleged to belong to Peltier and a bullet casing that prosecutors claimed matched the weapon. However, discrepancies in the forensic analysis raised doubts about these claims. The FBI withheld critical ballistics reports from the defense, and later reviews of the evidence revealed that the bullet casing did not definitively match Peltier's rifle. The prosecution also leaned on the testimony of individuals who placed Peltier at the scene of the crime. Yet many of these witnesses later alleged that their statements had been obtained under duress, with some claiming they were threatened or intimidated by federal agents. These accounts painted a troubling picture of a trial built on shaky foundations. For Peltier, the outcome of the trial was devastating. The jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The decision sent shockwaves through Native American communities and human rights organizations, many of whom believed that Peltier had been railroaded by a justice system more interested in securing a conviction than uncovering the truth. The trial also left unanswered questions about what had truly happened on June 26, 1975. While it was clear that Kohler and Williams had been killed in a brutal ambush, the identity of their killers remained murky. Ballistic evidence suggested that multiple weapons had been fired during the shootout, but no conclusive proof emerged to tie Peltier directly to the execution-style killings. Peltier himself has consistently maintained his innocence, admitting that he was present at Pine Ridge that day, but denying any involvement in the murders. As Leonard Peltier began serving his sentence, his case became a lightning rod for controversy. Advocates for Peltier argued that his conviction was the result of a politically motivated trial tainted by misconduct and racism. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials and the families of the slain agents viewed his conviction as a necessary step toward justice. The trial may have ended, but the battle over Leonard Peltier's fate was just beginning. His case would go on to inspire protests, petitions, and calls for clemency, keeping his name in the headlines for decades to come. Leonard Peltier's conviction in 1977 was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of a decades-long battle that would see his case scrutinized, debated, and held up as a symbol of systemic injustice. Almost immediately after the trial, questions began to emerge about the evidence, the fairness of the proceedings, and the conduct of the FBI. Peltier's defense team worked tirelessly to uncover discrepancies that could challenge the validity of his conviction, and what they found was alarming. One of the most glaring issues was the ballistics evidence presented at trial. The prosecution had argued that a rifle belonging to Peltier was the murder weapon, but the FBI withheld critical reports that cast doubt on this conclusion. Years later, it was revealed that the bullet casing found near the scene did not match Peltier's rifle, directly contradicting the government's claims. This wasn't just an oversight. It pointed to a deliberate attempt to suppress evidence that could have exonerated Peltier. The FBI's justification for withholding this information was that it was immaterial to the case, but for Peltier's supporters, it was a smoking gun, proof that the trial had been compromised from the start. Equally troubling were the testimonies used to convict him. Myrtle Pourbaix, the woman whose affidavit played a key role in securing Peltier's extradition, had recanted her statement before the trial even began. She openly admitted that the FBI had coerced her, threatening her safety and pressuring her to sign a statement implicating Peltier. Despite these revelations, her recanted testimony wasn't fully explored during the trial, leaving a significant cloud of doubt over the integrity of the proceedings. Other witnesses who testified against Peltier later claimed they had been intimidated or manipulated by federal agents, further eroding confidence in the prosecution's case. The broader context of the time cannot be ignored. The Pine Ridge Reservation was effectively a war zone in the 1970s, with violence between the traditionalist Lakota people, supported by AIM, and a faction loyal to the tribal government backed by federal authorities. Over 60 unsolved murders occurred on the reservation during this period, most of them involving Native activists. The FBI was deeply entrenched in these conflicts, and many believed that Peltier's conviction was as much about dismantling AIM as it was about seeking justice for the slain agents. As these troubling details came to light, Peltier's case began to attract widespread attention. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, took up his cause, arguing that he had been denied a fair trial and was a political prisoner. High-profile figures like Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, and Desmond Tutu joined the chorus of voices calling for his release. For his supporters, Peltier was not just a man, but a symbol of the struggle for Native American rights and a victim of systemic oppression. But while Peltier's advocates fought for his freedom, the families of Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams held steadfast in their belief that justice had been served. The pain of losing their loved ones in such a brutal manner was a wound that never healed. For them, Peltier's conviction was not a political statement, but a necessary reckoning for the lives that had been taken. The FBI Agents Association consistently opposed any calls for clemency, arguing that to release Peltier would be to dishonor the memory of the two men who had died in the line of duty. Over the years, the push for Peltier's release gained momentum, but it also faced significant political obstacles. Successive US presidents were petitioned to grant clemency, but none took action. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump all declined to intervene, each for their own reasons. Some cited the opposition from law enforcement as a decisive factor, while others were unwilling to wade into a case as polarizing as Peltier's. Despite these setbacks, Peltier's supporters remained undeterred. They organized protests, launched awareness campaigns, and lobbied tirelessly to bring his case to the forefront of public consciousness. His age and declining health became focal points of their argument. By the 2020s, Peltier was in his late 70s, suffering from diabetes and other chronic illnesses. For his advocates, it wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about allowing an elderly man to live out his final years in peace. The fight for Peltier's freedom was about more than one man's fate. It became a lens through which broader issues were examined: the treatment of Native Americans by the federal government, the fairness of the justice system, and the role of activism in challenging systemic power. Each new revelation about the case added fuel to the fire, keeping the story alive and ensuring that Leonard Peltier's name remained synonymous with both controversy and resilience. Even as years turned into decades, the debate over his guilt or innocence never faded, and the questions surrounding his trial became impossible to ignore. Would justice ever truly be served, or had the system already failed? The answers depended on who you asked, but one thing was certain: Leonard Peltier's case was far from over. In recent years, President Joe Biden has faced increasing pressure to address Leonard Peltier's case. Advocates for Peltier argue that clemency would be an act of justice, recognizing decades of controversy surrounding his conviction. While no official decision has been made, the debate continues to intensify, with both supporters and critics weighing in on what such an act would mean for the justice system and Biden's legacy. The announcement came quietly, but the impact was anything but subtle. Advocates hope that Biden will use his clemency powers to commute Peltier's sentence, allowing the man at the center of one of America's most controversial criminal cases to spend his remaining years outside prison. The decision immediately ignited a firestorm of reactions, with praise and condemnation pouring in from all sides. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to appreciate the polarizing nature of Peltier's case. To his supporters, his release was long overdue, a long-awaited acknowledgement of a justice system that had failed not only him, but the Native American community as a whole. For decades, activists, celebrities, and human rights organizations had called for his freedom, arguing that his trial had been tainted by misconduct, bias, and a lack of concrete evidence. The timing of Biden's decision was seen as a statement, an acknowledgement of the historical injustices faced by indigenous peoples in the United States, and a bold move to rectify one of the most glaring examples of systemic inequity. But for others, including the families of FBI agents Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams, if Biden were to grant clemency, many law enforcement officials and the families of the victims would likely see it as a betrayal. The FBI Agents Association has consistently opposed clemency, arguing that it would dishonor the memory of Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams, who were killed in the line of duty. To them, Peltier was a convicted killer, and his release was an insult to the memory of the two men who had died in the line of duty. The FBI Agents Association, representing thousands of federal agents, issued a scathing statement condemning the decision. They argued that Biden's actions undermined law enforcement and disrespected the sacrifices made by Kohler and Williams. The agents' families, who had endured decades of grief, and fought tirelessly to oppose Peltier's release, were devastated by the news. The reaction from political leaders was equally divided. Some hailed Biden's decision as a courageous step toward reconciliation and justice, while others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that prioritized political activism over accountability. The decision also drew inevitable comparisons to past presidents, particularly Donald Trump, who had staunchly opposed clemency for Peltier during his administration. Some speculated that Biden's move was a deliberate contrast to Trump's hardline stance, signaling a shift in how the federal government would approach cases of historical and social significance. But Biden's decision was not without its strategic considerations. By granting clemency to Peltier in his final days in office, Biden ensured that the fallout, whether positive or negative, would not impact his political agenda moving forward. It was a calculated risk, and one that many saw as an attempt to cement his legacy as a president willing to address historical wrongs, even at the expense of controversy. For Leonard Peltier, the moment of his release was bittersweet. At 80 years old, his health was fragile, and the decades spent in prison had taken their toll. His supporters, who had fought tirelessly for his freedom, greeted the news with celebration and relief. For them, it was a victory not just for Peltier, but for the broader movement for indigenous rights. In interviews following his release, Peltier expressed gratitude to those who had stood by him and vowed to continue advocating for justice for Native Americans. The ongoing push for clemency in Peltier's case has reignited discussions about broader implications for justice and reconciliation. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its past. The systemic mistreatment of Native Americans, the heavy-handed tactics of law enforcement during periods of social unrest, and the enduring legacy of racial and political bias in the justice system. For many, Peltier's freedom was a reminder that the fight for justice is never straightforward, and that the lines between guilt and innocence, justice and injustice, are often blurred by the complexities of history. As the dust began to settle, one thing became clear. Biden's decision to grant clemency to Leonard Peltier would not be easily forgotten. It would remain a defining moment of his presidency and a flashpoint for debates about justice, reconciliation, and the power of the federal government. Whether seen as an act of compassion or a grave mistake, whether or not Leonard Peltier is granted clemency, his case will remain a flashpoint for debates about justice, accountability, and the treatment of marginalized communities. What do you think? Should Peltier's sentence be commuted, or would clemency undermine justice for the victims? Share your thoughts. We want to hear from you. The release of Leonard Peltier under Joe Biden's clemency order has sparked one of the most heated debates in recent memory. For some, it was a long overdue act of justice and compassion. For others, it was an egregious betrayal of the rule of law and the memories of two fallen FBI agents. The questions surrounding this decision have left the country divided, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, legacy, and politics. Biden's choice to commute Peltier's sentence came as a shock to many, especially given the weight of opposition from law enforcement agencies and the families of the victims. For nearly 50 years, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams have been remembered as honorable men who gave their lives in the line of duty. Their deaths were brutal, senseless, and left a void in the lives of their families that can never be filled. By commuting Peltier's sentence, Biden effectively reopened wounds that many believed had long since scarred over, leaving the agents' loved ones devastated. How can justice be served, they ask, when the man convicted of killing their fathers, brothers, and sons is allowed to walk free? For others, Biden's decision represented something entirely different, a reckoning with a justice system that many believe failed Peltier from the start. His supporters point to decades of evidence that the trial was marred by misconduct, from the suppression of key ballistics reports to allegations of coerced testimonies. They argue that Peltier was made a scapegoat, not because of concrete evidence, but because he was an outspoken Native American activist in a time of heightened tension between federal authorities and the American Indian movement. To them, Peltier's freedom is not about erasing the tragedy of Kohler and Williams' deaths. It's about addressing the systemic injustices that put him behind bars in the first place. But was this truly the right way to address those injustices? That's the question many are struggling to answer. As a video maker, it's not our job to tell you what to believe. We're here to present the facts and let you decide. Yet, it's hard to ignore the glaring contradictions in Biden's decision. Why now, after so many decades of bipartisan resistance to clemency for Peltier? Was this about justice, or was it about political optics? Critics argue that Biden's choice wasn't motivated by compassion, but by a desire to leave a lasting legacy. As his presidency drew to a close, Biden faced mounting pressure to address historical grievances, particularly those involving marginalized communities. Granting clemency to Leonard Peltier allowed him to frame his final days in office as a moment of moral courage. But was it courage, or was it political theater? Another layer to this controversy is the stark contrast between Biden's decision and Donald Trump's stance on the matter. Trump, during his presidency, firmly opposed clemency for Peltier, aligning himself with law enforcement and the FBI Agents Association. If Biden were to grant clemency to Peltier, it could signal a shift in federal policy, one that contrasts with the hardline stance taken by former President Donald Trump, who opposed clemency for Peltier. Such a move would likely spark debates about whether it reflects a genuine commitment to justice or a broader political statement. But was this really about undoing Trump's legacy, or did Biden genuinely believe this was the right thing to do? It's a question that's left political analysts and ordinary citizens alike debating the motivations behind this polarizing act. What's even more unsettling is the precedent this sets. If Peltier's release is based on claims of an unfair trial, does this mean other high-profile cases should be re-examined under the same lens? If systemic bias is a factor, how many others have been wrongfully convicted but remain behind bars without the benefit of political attention? And if the government can simply reverse a conviction after decades of legal battles, what message does that send about the finality of justice? The implications of Biden's decision go far beyond Leonard Peltier. It forces us to ask hard questions about the balance between mercy and accountability, about how we remember victims and the families they leave behind, and about whether political motivations should ever play a role in decisions of this magnitude. For some, Biden's choice to commute Peltier's sentence was a courageous step toward healing old wounds. For others, it was a betrayal that reopened them entirely. So, where do you stand? Was this an act of justice or an abuse of presidential power? Can the legacy of Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams coexist with the freedom of Leonard Peltier? Or has Biden's decision forever tainted the pursuit of justice in this case? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts on this complex and controversial moment in history.